This week, Theresa Lanowitz from Level Blue is with us to discuss reactive cybersecurity budgets. Then Todd Tiemann from ESG joins us to talk about data security posture management. Finally, in the enterprise security news, some big fundings, no less than 4 acquisitions, silencing the EDR silencers, ghost jobs, overinflated estimates on open cybersecurity jobs, weaponizing Microsoft Copilot, fun projects with disposable vapes. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Graylog elevates enterprise-level cybersecurity through its comprehensive SIEM, centralized log management, and API security solutions. Built on the Graylog platform, Graylog Security combines SIEM, security analytics, threat detection, and incident response capabilities. Unlike traditional SIEMs, which offer complex and costly setups, Graylog Security simplifies security and operational challenges with an optimal blend of licensing, people, and infrastructure costs. To see a demo, visit securityweekly.com/Graylog. ThreatLocker implements a least privileged approach to cybersecurity, blocking every executable unless specifically authorized by your team. This methodology mitigates ransomware, supply chain attacks, and zero-day exploits. It ensures 24/7, 365 protection for your organization. To learn more about how ThreatLocker can help prevent known and unknown threats in your digital environment, safeguard your data and operations from threat actors, and align your organization with compliance frameworks, visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy National Men Make Dinner Day. That's a real thing, according to the internet. This is episode 383, recorded on Thursday, November 7th, 2024. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is the Admiral of ASPM, the Captain of Content, Katie Teitler-Santullo. You making dinner tonight, Katie, or you going to make your guy do it?
Technically, no, but it certainly isn't my husband.
Going out?
No, I usually make something big at the beginning of the week and then eat it for the majority of the week. It's usually vegetable based, so it doesn't get disgusting. He might heat it up, but if I relied on men making dinner, I would have a lot of peanut butter sandwiches for dinner.
Yeah, it always struck me as funny. I cooked in restaurants when I was a teenager growing up, and it was one of my mom's requirements for moving out of the house was that I knew how to cook for myself. So, like, that was taken care of at a very early age in my teens since I worked in restaurants. I've always enjoyed cooking. It's somewhat therapeutic and zen for me to get in the kitchen. I just love to cook for people. That's my love language.
Well, anytime you want to come over, you and your girlfriend are welcome, and you can cook for me any day of the week, whether it's National Men Cooking Day or not.
We will. I even every Tuesday when I go to bar trivia, they call me Snack Machine. I bring the snacks.
Not a bad title to hold. No.
Yeah. I'm also kind of built like a snack machine, kind of big and heavy. All right. This interview is sponsored by Level Blue. Today's topic is not men making dinner. It's reactive security budgets. We are excited to have Theresa Lanowitz back with us again. She's the chief evangelist at Level Blue. And welcome back, Theresa.
Thanks so much, Adrian. It's really nice to be back here with you.
Yeah, likewise. I really enjoy our conversations, and today's going to be no different. It's. I think this is one of those things that it's just easy to lose track of because it's just the way things have always been, right? There's a lot of things in cybersecurity where when you're used to jumping from fire to fire, when you're used to being reactive, it's kind of hard to imagine anything else. And I remember with my enterprise experience, every now and then I talk to somebody who worked somewhere where things were sane. I was like, wow, what's that like? What's it like to to not be constantly lacking training budget and jumping from one incident to the next, and to have the things that you asked for, and to do preparation, to not be fixing and configuring things as you go. So it's and this comes out of Level Blue's cyber resilience reporting. I think that's where this was one of the questions that you guys had for the respondents for that survey. Where did this? I presume you had some hand in forming these questions. Where does this fit in with cyber resilience?
So that's a really great place, I think, to probably start. So Level Blue, every year we do the futures report. And as the leader of thought leadership, I'm the one that ideates on this survey that we go off, a field survey that we go off and we conduct around the world. This year we spoke to 1,050 survey participants in 18 different countries, and it was C-suite, C-suite -1, C-suite -2. So those decision makers and the heavy influencers in making the decisions. And so most definitely, yes, I have a hand in putting these questions together, but I'm not the one answering the questions. So we rely on people from around the world to answer those questions because we want to hear exactly what is going on inside of cybersecurity organizations. And this idea of the cybersecurity team being overlooked, underfunded, siloed, and then what we also found out was that cybersecurity organizations, their budget is really a more reactive type of budget compared to their counterparts. If you look at their counterparts, the CIO, the CTO, for example, their budgets are more proactive. They know at the beginning of every fiscal year what their budget's going to be. They also probably have a pretty good plan of what they're going to do. And the cybersecurity respondents told us this is not the way for us, and we would love it to be that way. As you said, having something that is a little more planned, a little bit more laid out. And you're always going to have those reactive types of times where maybe there is something that you just weren't prepared for and you need some reactive type of budget. But overall, your budget should be known, it should be plannable, and it should be executable against that plan, tied to critical few objectives that the business is actually putting forward. So there's that need for the cybersecurity team, specifically the CISO, to understand what's going on in the business and to say, yes, we can align and we can make that happen and we can be proactive.
And I imagine some reactivity is kind of necessary here, for other groups as well. Like I imagine Apple didn't have any before November 2021 when ChatGPT first came out. Apple didn't have any plans to release something called Apple Intelligence, and Microsoft didn't have any plans to release something called Microsoft Copilot. But they released that technology, and even though some of those companies were working on some of the stuff behind the scenes, it seemed like it shuffled around everybody's priorities. So I imagine some CIOs and CTOs were pretty reactive then. I know we were on the security side. I took dozens and dozens of advisory calls with enterprises around, how do we do AI governance and all those things. So how do you figure out like what the right amount of proactive versus reactive is?
I don't think you're ever going to eliminate the reactive, because the example you brought up with ChatGPT being unleashed, and even though companies knew this was coming and they were working on things, they had to accelerate their timeline. So you look at things from a cybersecurity perspective. We had a major breach in the beginning of the year caused by ransomware. And the ultimate, once they did the forensics on it, it came down to multi-factor authentication was not enabled. So every organization you talk to now, whether they are in that specific industry or in another industry, they all were mandated, hey, go take a look at our multi-factor authentication. Are we using multi-factor authentication correctly? So that's an example of being reactive. But that reactive mode should never really have happened from that multi-factor authentication point of view. That is a known cybersecurity control that should have been in place for a long, long time. So you're always going to have those reactive events. Some of them are going to be caused by what happens with your competitors, in the example that you gave with generative AI coming out. But you should be able to plan with the critical business objectives that the business is putting forward to be able to say, okay, if in an ideal world, here's what we're going to do from a cybersecurity point of view this year. And a lot, I think, of what we're going to see in 2025 from a cybersecurity perspective will be that alignment between the CISO and the line of business, because we saw that happen over the past several years with the CIO and the line of business. So I think that alignment between the CISO and the line of business is something that we're going to see a lot of in 2025.
If you're talking about budgets, so you mentioned, the reactivity versus the proactivity of some other groups, tech groups in the organization. Did any of the respondents elaborate on why they think that's happening?
In terms of the reactive budget, yes. So we gave them a choice of why is your budget being given to you in a reactive mode. And they came back. The number one answer was something happened to my competitor. And our leadership said, we don't want to be in that situation. So we want to avoid the problem that our competitor has. So that's a classic problem. Just avoid what happened to your competitor. So a competitor's breach, maybe they had a breach and maybe they found out that their cybersecurity controls weren't what they should be. We're also seeing from this reactive budget point of view, we also saw a lot of respondents come back and say, we had to get cybersecurity insurance this year and we had to implement a new control so that we could get insurance. And that was a big part of the reactive budget. The other things that we saw were supply chain requests. So in the supply chain, regardless of where you are in the supply chain, somebody in your supply chain may come to you and say, we need to make sure we're going to do an audit. We need to make sure that you have this particular control enabled. So supply chain requirements. And then there were a lot of new regulations that came out this year. And some of these cybersecurity teams just weren't prepared for those new regulations. So in order to meet compliance and regulation, they needed to be prepared. And those types of things, that compliance and regulation meeting, understanding what's going on in your supply chain, those are perfect examples of how the cybersecurity team can be better aligned with the business. Those should not be new things that are happening inside the organization, because from a business perspective, let's take regulation, for example, and compliance. From a business perspective, the business is certainly planning to make sure that they're doing what they need to do in order to continue to conduct business in that industry. So the cybersecurity team should not be left out of that. And that's one of the other things we found too, is that on a per project basis, there's not a through line item for security. And I think that as security professionals, we look at that and we say, that's not too shocking. But if you're a business person, you look at that and not having that through line budget item for cybersecurity, that's extremely shocking. And you have to say to yourself, why is my business not doing this? Why is my business a little loose, if you will, on the cybersecurity side?
Why do you think that is? Why? I know this might not speak really to the respondents, but do you think that some of the responsibility lies in security because we should be more proactive with reaching out to the business and collaborating with the business and trying to align with the business? And or at the same time, do you think it's that the business still doesn't actually see security as an essential business function?
I think both things are true, which is an odd thing to say, right? Because yes, from a cybersecurity perspective, we should definitely be reaching out, doing more collaboration across the business. And that's a cultural change. So from a cultural perspective, you have to say, the cybersecurity team is not this department of no. They want to be helpful. They want to be collaborative. And so that has to happen slowly over time. So I think that's true, that the cybersecurity team is still fairly isolated and siloed. But in many cases, I do think in many cases that the business just doesn't understand what cybersecurity does. They know there are some really smart people that they pay to keep them safe, and so far so good. But what happens if something does happen, that you experience a cybersecurity breach or some type of incident that you really have to remediate from, and it impacts the business. And I think, unfortunately, that latter example where something unforeseen happens that impacts the business, I think that's often when the cybersecurity team gets a lot of visibility into the C-suite, and that's not the right type of visibility either.
Right. First introductions matter, right?
Yeah, that's a perfect example of why first impressions matter. But one of the things that we have seen is that with the software bill of materials saying, you have to tell us where your software is coming from, that's helping in this idea of DevSecOps. So let's bring security forward in the life cycle versus making security just a checklist item, because security of your applications matters. Security of the source code that you're bringing into your organization matters, as well as making sure that you're securing the infrastructure and so on. So making sure that last development, application security has always been that last mile. And I think we're getting a little bit better on that last mile. I was just at a conference called LastCon, the Lone Star Application Security Conference, sponsored by the Austin OWASP team. Do you know the conference?
Yeah, I keynoted there a couple of years ago.
Did you? It's a great place because they talk about application security for 2 days straight. And there's and this is from my perspective, from an application development conference, from a security conference, there's not a lot of complaining. There are a lot of solutions that people highlight at that conference. Yeah. So it's a great conference. And the people who are attending are largely practitioners, and they're coming and they're sharing their best practices. And everybody walks away with knowledge. And I think that's where we are getting to with the development teams saying, okay, we need to make sure that we are collaborating with somebody on the security side. Because, a developer who's doing exceptionally hard work by writing code is not going to raise their hand and say, yes, let me take on yet another very difficult thing, security. And a security professional who's making sure the application security is correct is not going to raise their hand and say, yes, let me take on development. So you have to have that collaboration. They're two unique skill sets, two very different people. And I think I'm an optimist. I hope we're getting closer to that.
So, to that point, it does seem like, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have seen that mind map of what a CISO does. That's this huge spaghetti mess not a spaghetti mess, but it's very broad, right? It doesn't go super deep, but it covers a lot of stuff. And more CISOs are telling me they're now responsible for fraud and loss prevention in their organization. They're now responsible for privacy. They're now responsible for AI safety. Like these things keep getting tacked on. And it's no wonder being so broad, that it's easy to miss things, and you do have to be somewhat reactive. It's kind of hard to plan for all that. So I wonder, kind of organizationally what the solution is here. I think we've talked in the past, Theresa, about maybe breaking up the CISO role. Certainly there are organizations out there with BISOs that use that kind of model. But is the CISO covering too much stuff to be proactive about all of it?
I think you have a point there that possibly the CISO is covering too much to be proactive about all of that. And oftentimes what we still see is that the CISO is reporting into the CIO or maybe reporting into other parts of the organization where the CEO doesn't necessarily hear from the CISO on a regular basis, and that becomes problematic as well. And I think some of the things that you talked about with real-time fraud detection and prevention, that sort of thing, that plays a bigger part and goes into this idea of building a cyber resilient organization so that all of the stakeholders involved understand what their roles are if something happens, if a cyber attack happens, if some sort of natural disaster happens, if some sort of man-made event happens, how do we all play a role as leaders in this organization to make sure that our entire IT estate, so think about what that IT estate encompasses. It's all of your software, all of your apps that you've purchased, all of the custom software that you've written inside of your organization, all of your hardware, and that includes all of your laptops, your tablets, your phones, your desktops, your servers, the IoT devices that you've deployed. So it's unwieldy and it's very scattered, and that IT estate isn't doing anything but getting bigger and more complicated as well. And so that makes the case for this idea of building out cyber resilience. But interestingly enough, in our research, we found that 72% of governance organizations don't understand what cyber resilience is. And so leadership is saying, we're already spending money on cybersecurity. Why are we going to spend money on cyber resilience? And all of these things feed into that idea of cyber resilience.
Yeah, and it's and a lot of that work has to be done by IT, right? Like a lot of this kind of anti-fragility that you need in systems. You know, we still on a regular basis, I do advisory calls with enterprises, and they're like, yeah, we can't scan the OT stuff because it falls over. You know, like we're not allowed to touch these systems or assess these systems because the moment you look at them funny, you know, they break. And it's, you know, that's not something security can really fix. Like we try and find ways around it. Okay, maybe we just look at network traffic, and that's how we get asset information and threat information and vulnerability information. But yeah, I wonder if a lot of things get pinned on security, that security really doesn't have the power, you know, and it's not going to come out of their budget anyway, to make a difference on.
Absolutely. I think you're completely right on that. A lot of things get pinned to security, but in reality, you know, it should not be a blame game. And I think that's one of the problems that we've created over the past couple of decades, is that we like to assign blame to people rather than really understanding from a collaborative perspective, here's how we can fix this problem. You know, you talked about collecting information from an IoT device versus, you know, the IT department saying, yes, of course, security, go ahead, do what you need to do with our IoT devices. There's got to be workarounds for that. And that becomes problematic. And a lot of that just comes down to the CIO and the CISO, those two organizations, just not communicating and or just not understanding what the other is responsible for. So those responsibilities have to be clearly defined. And the collaboration has to be encouraged. And I do often think that the CISO struggles because in many cases, as I said earlier, the CISO is not reporting into the CEO. They may be reporting into the CIO. So therefore, the CIO is looking at the CISO and consequently that security team as being more subordinate to the CIO and those types of operational activities that the CIO is responsible for.
Is that something where the CISO just needs to work with the CIO, make sure that to improve that visibility problem, you know, to make sure that, you know, they're included in some of those messages and that they don't only show up when things are on fire?
Absolutely. You make such a good point that the CISO just doesn't show up when things are on fire, that the CISO is there every single day.
Associate them with bad, with badness.
Yeah. You don't want to associate, oh, the only time I see this person is when they have some bad news for me or when there's something bad happening. And that's one of the things that we highlight in our research. We say, you know, transform the way you're managing your cybersecurity organization. Get out, talk to other people, collaborate, let them know the good work that you're doing. And on the cybersecurity team, we have to be more approachable and we have to be less in our own metrics and be able to understand the bigger and broader business problem that is trying to be solved. Because at the end of the day, everybody has that same goal, and that is to make the business successful. But they have conflicting priorities along the way that may prevent that ultimate goal from being achieved. So that idea of collaboration, communication, just knowing each other, talking to each other goes a long way.
Something you mentioned earlier, you mentioned that you know, one of the places where things get kind of thrown topsy-turvy is when a competitor maybe has a breach or something like that. And so in a situation where like slow and steady wins the race, you're trying to get the fundamentals done. Like there's all this fundamental work to do. And then something like that happens that hits kind of close to home, or maybe the company itself has a breach. I'm curious, either anecdotally or from the data you have from this report, where are those knee-jerk responses coming from? Is it the CISO themselves that are getting distracted and then being more reactive with their budget, or is that kind of imposed down on them from the board, from the C-suite?
In most cases, that is imposed from the top down, from the C-suite, from the board. And you bring up an excellent example of my competitor has a breach. And if you look at things from a security perspective, you only want to do one of three things. You want to fix a problem that you know you have. You want to avoid a problem, and that comes under avoidance. I want to avoid the problem my competitor has because I'm running pretty much the same infrastructure. I'm running pretty much the same application stack and so on. So I want to avoid that problem, or I want to accomplish something. And so when you're a CISO, when you're in the security team, you can look at things through that lens. What do I want to fix? What do I want to avoid? What do I want to accomplish? And it's easy to identify what you want to fix and what you want to avoid. But it's a little bit more difficult to identify what you want to accomplish. And that's why that communication, that collaboration, aligning yourself with those critical few business objectives, that's why that becomes so important.
And a budget is a very planned thing, right? You're going to do some quarterly and annual budget planning. I imagine along with that, maybe is one of the things CISOs can do here is say, look, there are going to be things that tempt us to go running off into the jungle, but we should stay focused on, building the thing we're building here and not getting distracted. Are there opportunities and we see it also sometimes when a company has a breach and handles the PR aspect of it badly. You can kind of see, okay, they weren't prepared for that. And the knee-jerk responses are often the exact opposite that you want to do. Like instead of being transparent about it, they try and hide the fact that they had a breach, for example. So I wonder, like, is there an opportunity for the CISO to maybe prepare them from this so the knee-jerk reactions don't affect them as much?
Absolutely. I think you bring up such excellent points. These knee-jerk reactions you brought up. Perhaps there's some sort of public relations event that occurred that seemed a little tone deaf to what customers were experiencing because of a breach. That comes down to those formalized incident response plans. And yes, of course, you have NIST framework that you can follow, that sort of thing. But you have to make sure from a resilience perspective that you're including all of those stakeholders. And that includes a crisis PR team to be able to say, here's when we're going to communicate, here's how we're going to communicate. It might include others in your supply chain. So it's not just those technical people on the cybersecurity side. It encompasses that entire business and whoever is a stakeholder within that business. So I think those are excellent points to remember.
So cyber resilience applies to the people as well, the
Most
staff.
Most definitely. And a lot of that comes back to we live in silos, especially on the cybersecurity side. We live in that silo. So if you want to be truly resilient, you have to break down those silos. And this is something from an IT perspective. We've been talking about this for a long, long time. But the truth holds regardless of whether you sit in an application development team, an operations team, a cybersecurity team, those silos have to be eradicated.
So if you're talking about cyber resilience and even just planning, budgeting for cybersecurity, it feels like there's a little bit of keeping up with the Joneses that's still going on when it comes to security, right? Like, oh, our industry, competitor got hacked. So, oh no, what do we do? Never a good thing. You never want to be playing that game. What would you recommend to CISOs, VPs of security to put a stop to that? And the advice you could give them so they can start to be a little more proactive but not feel like they're stepping over the line so much, like, here are all the horrible things that can happen. We don't want that. But how should someone approach this if they want to be more proactive without that fear factor?
It's interesting. It sounds as though you're asking, how do you boil the ocean? Right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. It's a difficult task. And I think that you're not going to be able to achieve that overnight. You can't say, here's one thing that you can do. It's a collaborative effort. You understand what your attack surface is, and your attack surface is constantly expanding. You understand that maybe there are things on that attack surface that we don't even know about. So making sure you understand your attack surface, making sure you know where your software is coming from. So are you bringing in a lot of open source software for some of the things that you're writing? Where is that open source software coming from? So following that guidance of the SBOM, I think, is really important. And I'm kind of going from the bottom up. So understanding that attack surface, understanding that SBOM, knowing where your vulnerabilities are. You're never going to put out something that is 100% vulnerability free or 100% defect free. But if you know where those vulnerabilities are, and you know the likelihood of those vulnerabilities and or those defects being exploited, you're better off. And then, of course, at the top comes this idea of working together collaboratively to say, here's what we need to do. Here's what needs to happen in all of these areas. Here's what needs to happen in the supply chain. Here's what needs to happen with understanding our attack surface. So, one of the things we talk about in terms of cyber resilience is know what your barriers are. So if you can identify those barriers, that helps. Be secure by design. That comes down to knowing things such as your attack surface, understanding your vulnerabilities, and so on. And then bringing in those trusted advisors. I think so many organizations are out there and they feel as though they have to do this alone. So don't feel as though you have to do this alone. Bring in these trusted advisors to help you out. People such as cybersecurity consultancies, managed security services providers, global systems integrators, telcos, and so on. And then make sure that you are looking at that cybersecurity strategy and aligning with the business, and then transform that cybersecurity strategy, which we talked about quite a bit.
A little like boiling the ocean.
Just like boiling the ocean, exactly.
I think that nicely wraps another great conversation, Theresa. Love having these with you. Thank you again for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thank you so much.
All right, make sure you visit securityweekly.com/levelblue to learn more about them. And stick around. When we come back, we're going to talk data security posture management with Todd Tiemann from ESG.